Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. And welcome to part 2 of part 1 of 1971, or the second half of the first quarter of 1971. Last time we talked extensively about the record releases from 1970 that were still doing well early in 1971, movies, things like that. Now I'd like to talk about the record releases that came out early in 1971, also television and a few other things in that area. This will be very light on Beach Boy content because in part 1 we already talked about what the Beach Boys were up to in the first quarter of 1971. So I'd like to continue on with more of what was going on in the culture at the time, starting with hit singles. The hit singles as the year began were at number 1, My Sweet Lord by George Harrison. He had the number 1 single and the number 1 album in the country as 1971 began. At number 2 was One Less Bell to Answer by the Fifth Dimension, written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. At number 3 was Knock 3 Times by Dawn. Weird as it seems now, the original US picture sleeve for this single shows 4 guys, none of whom actually sing on the record. It was actually sung by Tony Orlando, Tony Wine, and Linda November, none of whom are credited. Dawn at this point was purely a studio group. With the success of this single and the single Candida, a group was formed with Tony Orlando, Thelma Hopkins, and Joyce Wilson, who would of course go on to bigger things, including their own variety series later in the decade. At number 4 was Tears of a Clown by Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Number 5 was Black Magic Woman by Santana. Number 6 was I Think I Love You by the Partridge Family. We'll talk more about them in a little bit. Number 7 was Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is by Chicago from their first album. Number 8 was The Supremes with Stoned Love. It was their second top 10 single after Diana Ross had left the group at the end of 1969, be their last top 10 single. Although they had a single Nathan Jones later in the year, it only went to 16. In my mind, that's the superior record. Nathan Jones is actually really a cool record. Number 9 was Van Morrison's Domino, and following up, leading out the top 10 was Gypsy Woman by Brian Hyland. And new album releases at the time, in January, we got Elvis Presley's Elvis Country, which is actually a bit of a concept album with the track I Was Born 10,000 Years Ago cut up and sandwiched between each of the tracks in order to make it a bit of a concept album. So even Elvis was getting a little progressive here early in 1971. Also in January of the year, we got Chicago 3, their big double extravaganza. And Janis Joplin's Pearl was released, her nearly completed first posthumous release. Of course, she had passed away in October of 1970, about 4 months prior to the release of Pearl, which, as I say, was nearly complete when she died. And we got also in the US in January, Elton John's Tumbleweed Connection. This had been released in the UK in October of 1970, just as the Elton John album was entering the top 40 in the US. So I'm sure they delayed the release of this in order to let the Elton John album have its run on the chart and then bring out Tumbleweed Connection. Tumbleweed Connection would eventually go to number 5 on the US chart despite not having any hit single. Such was the popularity of Elton John as an album artist at that time. Early February brought the release of Andy Williams' Love Story album with its vocal version of the Francis Lai theme from the number 1 hit movie. Early February also brought a new album from Carole King, half of the famed Brill Building songwriting team of Goffin and King. This album had a single called It's Too Late. Both the single and the album would take a little while to catch on, but when they did, obviously it would be in a big way, and we'll talk more about this landmark album later on. Also from February, we got David Crosby's first proper solo album called If I Could Only Remember My Name. My relationship with this album for a long time was that a lot of record store employees chased me around from time to time going, "You really ought to get this album, it's really good, man." And I was, yeah, right. When I finally got it, I'm now somebody that runs around going, "You really got to get this record, it's really good, man." It is a pretty terrific album. I got some theories about David Crosby. One, I think he's highly underrated. His contribution to pop music's development in the 60s and 70s, rock music's development, I think has been highly overlooked. The other thing is he's really a bit of a paradox. He's a guy that seems to have a lot of trouble getting along with people, but at the same time, he loves to collaborate. He almost always works in collaboration with other people, be it the Byrds, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and sometimes Young. Even on this album includes Graham Nash, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, members of the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Santana. It's really, again, a collaborative effort, though this is ostensibly a David Crosby solo album. Also in February, we got the sophomore effort from the Partridge Family. Partridge Family Up to Date. And again, we'll talk more about the Partridge Family very shortly. Also from February was a greatest hits package from Three Dog Night called Golden Biscuits, and Barbra Streisand's Stony End album. Released in March of 1971, we got James Taylor's follow-up to the Sweet Baby James album, Mudslide Slim and the Blue Horizon. This has some great stuff on it, though it represents something of a sophomore slump for James Taylor, though technically I know it's his third album. As so often happens when a record company has a hit, they pressure the artist to release a new album, never mind the fact that he hasn't really had time to develop sufficient material. Under the circumstances, I think James did pretty well here with Mudslide Slim. And we got Sitting on a Park Bench, Aqualung by Jethro Tull. Also released in March was This Is a Recording, a comedy album by Lily Tomlin doing her popular Ernestine the telephone operator character, which was featured on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. And the Cry of Love album, a posthumous release from Jimi Hendrix, featuring tracks he had been working on for an album when he passed away the previous September. The top 10 television shows as 1971 began were, at number 1, Marcus Welby, M.D., a medical drama starring Robert Young as kindly Marcus Welby and James Brolin as dashing young Dr. Stephen Kiley. It was in its second season, Tuesday nights on ABC. At number 2 was a new comedy variety series, The Flip Wilson Show, starring Flip Wilson, Thursday nights on NBC. This show really felt like the hip place to be in 1971. Its modern, up-to-date set and its sort of theater in the round presentation, which highlighted the audience, gave you the feeling that you were watching a live performance. And though he would later over-rely on recurring characters and catchphrases, Flip Wilson made a great host. He brought a hip informality to the proceedings that started to make all other variety shows on TV suddenly look kind of dated. And number 3 was Here's Lucy, the successor to The Lucy Show, still co-starring Gail Gordon, and now with her real-life kids Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr. There was a lot of emphasis on celebrity guests that her character, Lucy Carter, just happened to run into every week or two. It was in its third season on CBS. And number 4 was Ironside, featuring former Perry Mason Raymond Burr as Chief Inspector Robert T. Ironside. It was in its fourth season on NBC Thursday nights following The Flip Wilson Show. And at number 5 was the show that seemed like it was never gonna die, Gunsmoke, in its 16th season on CBS Monday nights just before Here's Lucy. At number 6 was the ABC Movie of the Week, presenting the world premiere of an original motion picture produced especially for ABC. The number 7 show was in its third season on Wednesday nights, CBS Hawaii Five-0, starring Jack Lord as Steve McGarrett. Every week, McGarrett and his team from Five-0 would take on a gangster, terrorist, or criminal mastermind, and almost every week, McGarrett would get a full confession out of them, usually after haranguing them with some impassioned speech about getting their kind of rotten scum off the streets for the good citizens. It was like, geez, McGarrett, I confess already. Just please get out of my cell and stop talking. This, of course, allowed McGarrett to turn to his sidekick and deliver one of his famous catchphrases, "Book 'em, Dano, murder one." McGarrett's other big catchphrase came at the end of the previews for next week's show, when he would sign off by saying, "Be there, aloha." Something I still like to say whenever I make arrangements with anybody, be there, aloha. The number 8 rated show in early 1971 was Medical Center, starring dashing young Dr. Joe Gannon, played by Chad Everett. It was in its second season on CBS just before Hawaii Five-0. Sunday nights on NBC, still going strong after 12 seasons, was Bonanza. And at number 10, The FBI, a Quinn Martin production, starring Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. in its 6th season on ABC Sunday nights. I don't know if there were other periods like this, but I was surprised to see that only 2 of the top 10 shows were either comedy or variety. I don't know if that speaks to the national mood or the fact that a lot of TV comedy was getting a little long in the tooth. I mean, My Three Sons were starting to look like my three middle-aged dudes. And if the Clampetts hadn't by now, after 9 years in Beverly Hills, figured out that the cement pond was actually called a swimming pool, that was kind of on them at this point. And how many more spells could Endora cast on Darren to make him furious but yet come up with a great advertising slogan? TV comedy was a little wanting at this point, but changes were coming. Of course, for kids, the great place to be was ABC on Friday night with a terrific lineup that began with The Brady Bunch in its 2nd season. They were still a few years away from their butterfly collar, big hair, Malibu tan, groovy zenith at this point, but they were starting to have some memorable episodes like The Slumber Caper, where the boys disrupt Marcia, Jan, and Cindy's slumber party. They'd remain the anchor of the ABC Friday night lineup until August 1974, when they and their newfound cousin Oliver would finally meet cancellation. That was followed by Nanny and the Professor in its 2nd and final full season, starring Juliet Mills and Richard Long in the title roles. It was a show aimed squarely at young kids with a mystical, magical nanny so sweet she made Mary Poppins look like Max Cady. Then there was The Partridge Family, a show that had been new in the fall of 1970. Again, I want to talk about this, but I'm realizing I'm running out of time, so we will talk about The Partridge Family in episode 3 of 1971. Sorry about that. The Partridge Family was followed by That Girl in its 5th and final season, starring Marlo Thomas as Anne-Marie and Ted Bessel as her eternal boyfriend, Donald Hollinger. Later on was Love American Style, a racy series of comedy vignettes. At this time, this show came across as a little edgy and sexy. Now it just comes across as moronic. And closing out the evening's entertainment was the variety series This Is Tom Jones, in its 3rd season with popular Welsh singer Tom Jones, who might be introducing special guests or performing his new hit single, She's a Lady. And television was already beginning to look considerably different early in 1971. On January 1st, 1971 at midnight, cigarette advertising was banned from television, depriving broadcasters of what had been their largest single source of advertising revenue. They gave them an extra day and let them advertise through January 1st in order to get a few more ads in during the bowl games on New Year's Day. But the last cigarette ad on American TV was broadcast at 11:50 p.m. January 1st, 1971 during The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. On Tuesday, January 12th, a very unusual and controversial new TV comedy premiered on CBS called All in the Family. Apart from the frank, relevant, and sometimes unsettling subject matter, which was completely foreign to sitcoms up to this point, the show just looked very different from anything we were used to as a sitcom. It was filmed basically on one set with a live audience and looked more like a filmed version of a stage play than what we had come to think of as a TV sitcom. The audience was small, they were cautious, but they began to grow, and by May it would be the #1 TV show in the country. So that finally does it for the first quarter of 1971. That's 1 quarter down and 3 to go. And believe me, I haven't forgotten about the Beach Boys. We will talk more about the Beach Boys in upcoming episodes. And of course, we'll do a full episode on the Surf's Up album from August of 1971 as well. If you don't remember 1971, I hope you found this interesting. If you do remember 1971, I'd love to hear your recollections, anything from those early months that I may have left out and should have mentioned. I'd certainly appreciate your comments. So we'll see you next time. I appreciate you watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't. Next time we will talk about the second quarter of 1971. Be there. Aloha.